got a countdown. Ah, there we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the panel discussion. We're going to be talking about DevOps ideas and tools. We'll start off with some introductions. So I'm James Birnie. I am the head of platform engineering at Currency Cloud, which is very new for me. I've only been doing that role for the last month or so. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been that I get into look into all sorts of different companies that are really bad at what they do. So if you've ever seen any of my talks, I like to talk about how bad they are at doing things like DevOps or architecture or anything like that. That's all got to change now, obviously, now that I've gone over to the dark side and work for a product company. So yeah, before we kick off, I'd just like everybody to introduce themselves. I've got them written down on my piece of paper here. So we'll start with Johnny, please.
Hi, James. Thank you. My name is Johnny Hooyberghs. I'm from Belgium, and I work for a consultancy firm called Involve. We only work inside of Belgium right now, and actually even only the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium. And I'm mostly working on .NET backend stuff, really technical stuff, as a consultant helping different companies doing architectural design for their .NET applications and helping them to move their applications to the cloud, specifically Microsoft Azure then. I'm not really into DevOps specifically as my professional job, but of course I come into contact with many different teams and I can see how they do or want to do DevOps and how they fail to do DevOps. So yeah, that's me.
Cool, thank you, Johnny. Justin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, James. So I have more of a Node Ruby background. I actually am, as opposed to James, I am a product guy. Pretty much always worked for product teams, mainly in small startups, but I also used to be part of Big Blue at IBM. I worked on their cloud team, and I was fortunate enough to work on Apache OpenWhisk.
Oh, nice.
And contribute to that project. So I'm a bit of a full stack guy. You go all over the place, and DevOps is something that I do because I have to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll come on to exactly what that means in a moment. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thank you, James. So I'm Michael Haberman. Used to be an independent consultant when helping companies both with DevOps and cloud, mostly around the distributed application microservices. And then after a few years of doing that, I decided that I want to do my own thing. So now I'm founded a startup focusing on microservices.
Cool. I always respect people that have the courage to found a startup. You know, I worked in a startup for 9 years, but I certainly wouldn't have the career they were paying me. Okay, so we're here to talk about DevOps today. The interesting thing is, I mean, I've worked in IT for 20, 30 years now. I remember in the 90s, we talked about XP, then Agile, DevOps came along at some point. We talked about microservices, cloud native. And what I noticed around these times, at various points, these have all been buzzwords. And one of the problems with buzzwords is that people pick them up, redefine them, use their own thing, suffers from something called semantic diffusion, which is a Martin Fowlerism. So before we sort of get right into the conversation, I think I'd like to ask each of you just briefly, what do you think DevOps means? So I think Michael, you said you were an independent consultant working with DevOps and cloud. So why don't we start with you? What does DevOps mean to you?
Well, for me, DevOps is the organization, the people are responsible making sure that the code can run on the load on the system. And developers have all the tools to make sure they have the entire software development lifecycle ready to go, automated, convenient, visible. So I think that's the root concept of DevOps.
Okay. Does anybody else want to add anything to that? You're nodding on there, Martin. Sorry, Justin. Great notes.
Let me see. So to me, it's kind of like the moment that you commit something in Git or wherever system you're using, the moment that gets pushed to some kind of central place, that is the whatever happens with it after that, and how it gets run, and how it gets how everything gets managed. That's DevOps to me, and opposed to if you look at DevOps versus SysOps, which kind of like in my mind came before, DevOps came in when containers came in. So in my mind, those two things are also linked. If you're doing stuff in VPS, you might be doing SysOps. No, that's what it means to me.
Okay, cool. Johnny, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, for me, it's the working closely together with the operations team. DevOps can, of course, be a developer that does everything by himself. But for me, it can also be the operations team and the developers working together to make sure that whatever happens after the developer commits his code, that it gets deployed easily. Because today I can still see lots of developers committing their code and then saying something like, "Okay, now I don't care anymore. It's not my problem." Right. And of course, it should be your problem as a developer. So DevOps would be to care with what happens with your code if you deploy it, and care for the people that need to do that for you.
Okay. So I think a thing that I've just heard there is we're all saying DevOps is really a sort of mindset and an attitude and a thing that we do rather than a set of tools. But I heard a few different tool names. I heard Git. We heard about something else earlier. So, all of that tool chain, all of that tool set is clearly quite important. So I think I'd like to examine, just to sort of get some sort of feel for it, what sort of guiding principles do you think we should be looking at when we're thinking about any kind of DevOps implementation? Anybody want to run with that one? I can nominate. Go on. You go, Johnny.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, of course, because indeed I think about DevOps as a kind of a philosophy and a way of working, and the tools are there to support you. So I am actually very happy that today we have a wide range of tools that can help us in different ways. And for me, those tools should be really flexible. I should be able to use those tools and to modify those tools to fit how I work with my team of developers and my team of operations guys, basically. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Well, I think one thing I heard you say there when I'm getting it live, one of the things I used to hear a lot was you build it, you run it, which was a kind of principle that some of the teams I work with. I think, and again, a great thing I'd like to pick on there, you said you like to modify the tools to run them as you see fit. So it feels like what you're saying is that everything that you want to do, you're going to mold it to being appropriate to how it fits in that context, maybe?
Yeah, what I'm thinking about quite practically right now is, for example, I'm using a lot of Microsoft technology. So for development and deployment, I'm using Azure DevOps. Right. And in Azure DevOps, for example, you can create pipelines for builds, you can create pipelines for releases. And in a release pipeline, you have many options on how you want to do. You can do it fully automated, for example. You can say, okay, when a developer checks in its code or commits its code, it will be built by a build pipeline. That pipeline will create an artifact. That artifact can be picked up by a release pipeline. It can release it to different environments automatically in serial. Like if the test environment is successful, if all the automatic tests are successful, you can go automatically deploy it to the next environment in your pipeline. But you can also choose to have a manual interaction in between. You can, for example, if a part of your pipeline succeeds, you can send an email to a DevOps guy that just needs to click a button, then sees a report, and then can manually trigger the next step of the process. So this flexibility is very important to me, because some teams, they can do everything automated, but other teams, they really want that manual final check to see if everything's okay, if the timing is perfect. So I'm talking about that kind of flexibility.
Okay. All right. So I've heard a lot here about building pipelines and providing tools and so on. Some companies that I consulted into would have this thing called a DevOps team. I wonder if, let's bring in Justin. Have you seen that sort of behavior, a DevOps team? What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess it's necessary for some organizations, but if you don't have to do it. I don't think you should. It kind of reminds me a bit about, you know, back in the day you had the front end team and you had the back end team, and the front end team would write the HTML, maybe CSS, and the CSS, and would then give it to the back enders, and they'd then, you know, not really know why, and so they would mangle it, and then the front enders would get really upset at the back enders, and vice versa. There's complete disconnect, and I feel like the DevOps team, you could do that as well. Like I think it was Johnny who just said, like, you build it, you run it. I like that better. So if you have something that's very complicated and needs a full-time DevOps person, I'd prefer that person to actually be on the team that's working on that's makes basically keeping that product running. Now, if you want to create a DevOps organization within your company, then mandate that all of the teams run their own Kubernetes, and you'll be going. They'll just be focusing on DevOps constantly. I guess that's my pet peeve. Do Kubernetes last? That would be my principle.
Okay. Michael, have you got anything to say about DevOps teams? I mean, actually, before we go to Michael, it's funny what you were just saying there. I think this might be another thing that people misunderstand. I've got a deep suspicion when I was a consultant that when I went into a company and they had a DevOps team, I was suspicious that it was actually the same old infrastructure team that they'd had for 30 years, but they just rebranded. I don't know if you ever come across that sort of, I'm going to stick my neck out and say that might be an anti-pattern. Michael?
Yeah, definitely. I think for some aspect, DevOps is rebranding. He used to be, I don't know, sysadmin and IT guy, and now he became a DevOps. And to your question, the DevOps team, I think as technical guys, we are giving names, and we're trying to give significant names, and time goes by, those names are obsolete and they are not accurate. And I think DevOps had a lot of different implementation. You have DevOps running your production, and you have DevOps running your CI, and sometimes it's a bit different. So I think when you're saying DevOps team, you mean those people are not the application developers, they are more of the operation side, but it doesn't define what they do.
Right.
So yeah, maybe it's not the best name, but it does give you the context of what they are responsible for.
So does it feels like maybe, and again, I think from something that Johnny said, there are a lot of tools here, and we'll come on to some of the specific tools, but there's a lot of, I think in any sort of transformation, any sort of new thing, and I saw this a lot with microservices transformations, I think a lot of what we do is designed to perhaps simplify people's worlds, but you can't, I had this belief as a consultant that there is an inherent amount of complexity in any given system, and you can't remove that complexity, but you shift it into another place. So I wonder if the if we have a DevOps team, are these the people that curate the tools perhaps, or understand the tools, pass knowledge on? What do you think, Johnny? Is that something that you would like to see happening? Holding the knowledge on the tools, perhaps, or the practices?
It's a very good question, because I've seen from my experience many different implementations of this, where, as you told before, indeed, I've seen companies that just rebrand their IT personnel into the DevOps team. But I've also seen companies that do exactly what you say right now. Like, for example, I worked for a company that had a DevOps team, but what that DevOps team did was basically have all the knowledge on the tools, but also on the architectural design for the software. And then you had the developers themselves. They didn't have any rights to do anything. They just needed to code, and they always needed to ask the DevOps team, can you give me access to this, or can you give me access to that, or can you help me solve this problem, or can you help me solve that problem? And they basically only did code. And then the DevOps team, they were like the masters of the universe. They had all the tools in hand. So yeah, it's a good question, and maybe it's a good idea, but you don't need to go too far with that, of course.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I do have in my notes to return to that later. It's like, has anybody read Team Topologies, a book that was written a couple of years ago, describes different ways of organizing an organization? Because I think what we spoke a lot, we thought a lot during the microservices revolutions about streamlined teams or product-focused teams and how they should be able to do everything themselves. But I think a bit like what you said, I think it might have been Justin mentioned, you know, having somebody in the team who has all that knowledge as well. So distributing those sort of DevOpsy people into the teams. The problem with that pattern is that it sort of feels, I sometimes think there should be a sort of central repository for the way we do stuff, and we can go too much the other way. But yeah, in team topologies, what it suggests is you have streamlined teams, but you also have enabling teams, and you also have teams that it calls X as a service. So teams that provide stuff as a service to other teams. And I sort of think that this whole DevOps idea or this infrastructure idea fits into all that. Yeah, because we're looking in Currency Cloud at exactly how our teams interact and whether we're enabling things in the right way. And exactly as you just said, Johnny, you can go too much of one way, giving everybody all the power, but you can definitely go too much the other way. What you just described sounds to me as if that DevOps team in that setup has made itself a single point of failure.
Exactly.
And it's being a blocker.
It is actually happening today, because most of those people in that DevOps team are now in burnout, and there's only one guy remaining, and he will probably not last very long.
Okay. Has anybody else seen a DevOps or an infrastructure team being that sort of blockage, that single point of failure? And what sort of solutions would you have for that?
So I did say that happening, and it was mostly like a core platform team that were developers, and they started to take more and more responsibilities in the operation space. And yeah, there was like a bunch of tech lead architects, also DevOps, and then they kind of making all the decisions. And it's a very centric solution. And I think the solution is to distribute the knowledge, distribute the access to the tools, whether it's by, I don't know, taking this team, breaking it, and spread the people across other teams, or in some other way. But eventually, developers can be like these stupid people who just code. They need to understand how things are running, how things are happening. The better they understand, the less issues you're going to have in production, the more personnel to handle production that are happening.
Okay. All right. So just picking up very quickly on a theme there, and I know the three of us were talking about this before the call, before you joined, Justin, unfortunately. But so I'm going to throw this question at you, Justin. But you mentioned there, Michael, that part of what DevOps or that DevOps group, whether it's a team, whether it's a sort of knowledge sharing thing, needs to do is to pass that knowledge on. And I wondered, I was musing about how now that we all seem to work at home, certainly in the UK press, and I assume the English language press, there was a lot written about how surprised companies were at their productivity seemed to go up when we were all working at home. But I'm suspicious that we might be stealing productivity from tomorrow, in the sense that we're finding it harder and harder to pass information from group to group, from person to person. And in particular, I think from down to the less experienced members of the team, to the graduates and the people that are fresh to software development. So is there anything that does that time with DevOps, passing that mentality around, is that something you've ground up against, do you think?
That's a good question. Let me see. No, specifically because I started a company pre-corona, and it's only the two of us. So
okay.
So no, I haven't experienced this in real life. But I can understand that it could definitely become a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That one fell a bit flat. Why don't I try it over to Johnny? I think so. We just run with that theme for a moment. So you know, passing information around from team to team in the coronavirus world, is it a hindrance? Do we need to rethink how we do it?
I think it's a very good question, because basically this problem only hit me like 2 months ago, where I am by default, I'm kind of an introvert guy. So Corona was very cool for me. I could sit at home. I could basically focus on the work that I needed to do, talk with my team. I'm basically working in a very good team that's already used to do these things because I work with a couple of people from India, and they also live there. So we were doing things virtually for many years before, and I think we got it down quite good. But I'm working for a consultancy firm, so most of my colleagues work for different teams all over Belgium, and we were losing people this past year on quite a high rate. And it only hit me two weeks ago when talking to these people that they really have a hard time. They feel like they are standing still. They're not doing anything. They're just doing their work. They're not communicating with people. They have sometimes no idea. They really have that feeling of standing still and not going forward in their job, in their project, just because, indeed, like you said, people are all working by themselves. They are evolving by themselves, but they are not evolving as a team or as a human working in a team. So I really saw this happen this past year. So I think what you said about maybe the productivity is higher today, but it will bite us in the ass in a couple of years, most definitely.
Yeah. Are we stealing productivity from tomorrow? I think was the thing that I read. Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds a little bit more nicer than get bitten in the ass.
Go on, Michael.
I think that if you stand in the kitchen of a company and you just listen to people talk, you kind of know what's happening in the company.
Yeah.
And we lost that. We lost the ability to just hear what's happening and have informal talks. And now even when you start to talk with somebody in Slack, it's making it more formal, and you think about what you write or what you're going to say. And I think it's an overall problem, but even specifically with DevOps, when there is a lot of integration and you need a lot of knowledge to be shared, you kind of lose the time and the place to do it.
Now, I think I love your comment about the kitchen, because, as I say, I worked for ThoughtWorks for 4 or 5 years, and a lot of the engagements I'd be on, because I was, I call myself an ex-software developer. I'd moved into the sort of observing the organization type roles, and I actually just used to hang out in the kitchen. If I was like writing a report or making a presentation, I'd go and sit in the kitchen with my laptop and work there and just drink loads of cups of tea, being English. Or just a Friday afternoon, drink loads of beer, but just to overhear and butt into the conversations. And on one of the engagements I had, we had a rule, and I mean, this sounds crazy, but we actually had a rule that if we went to the pub, right, if we bought a round of drinks, as long as we were buying drinks for the client, at least some client people, then we could expense it. And apart from the fact that fulfilled UK tax law, it fulfilled a very basic function, which was that we needed to talk to the people, right? And as a consultant, we found that people told the truth more when they'd had a few free beers. So, it was always a good way to get information. So, I think maybe that's a really interesting theme. I'm going to return to that shortly. But one thing we talked a lot about was we've talked about enablement. We've talked about passing these skills on, with all of these sort of themes. That sort of speaks to me a bit about what we used to call transformation in consultancy. I wonder if anybody on the call has been involved in a sort of long-term transformation, and how did that look, and how did you understand what was going on? Does anybody want to pick that up?
Yeah, I had this experience, which actually started very interesting, because I started as a consultant to the company and then became an employee as a chief architect. And the company CTO was 100% sure that we don't need DevOps. His concept was just teach the developers to be DevOps. And from one point of view, it makes sense, right? You have people who can do it. If they learn and get the knowledge, they can do it. But also, you need now to obtain this knowledge, and you are going to pay for their mistakes. And I think we initially did a bit of an obvious thing. We did recruit DevOps and had a DevOps consultant come to help this team. I think 1.5 years later, we figure out that now we have a silo that if we have a production issue, they are the guys that we have to have on board. And then we started to share this knowledge and eventually close this team and just spread the people across the rest of the teams. So I think it's very natural to start with a silo because it's easier to obtain knowledge and easier to understand where you are at the process. But once it's starting to be a barrier and obstacle, then you need to start to spread the knowledge.
That sounds very similar to a model that we had at ThoughtWorks that we called Split and Seed, where we would we'd start 1 or 2 teams, which were mainly ThoughtWorks people, with a small number of client developers or client people in those teams. And when those teams were high performing, then the teams would split and form more teams. And that way it would spread the sort of knowledge throughout the organization. The goal being, and I think internal to an organization, that would work in a similar way with that sort of first siloing team of eventually making itself redundant. I think that would be the sort of pattern that you're driving at. So, okay. So I'm going to ask Johnny, just because I haven't come to Johnny for a while, or Justin, if you want to pick this up. If you've been involved in sort of, how do you know that your DevOps is working? What sort of tools and measures and metrics do you understand that things are working by? You want to go, Johnny?
Yeah. Yeah, again, a good question.
I just like to say to the audience, I did provide these questions in advance. So,
yeah, indeed. If most of the process is automated, and when an issue arises, you have the tools, you have the logs, you can find what is going on, and you can quickly get to the people that can help you fix this. It doesn't. I don't think it doesn't really matter if it's in the same team or if it's you or if it's someone from the operations team. I think you know when your DevOps is working correctly. That is when your releases go automated again, and most of the time things just go fine without any issue. But if things go wrong, that you can immediately react to that. And again, you don't. In Belgium, we say you don't pull your umbrella and say this is not my fault, but you can just contact your colleagues and work on the problem together and fix it quickly.
Okay, that all sounds like qualitative measurement of success, really. You know, if I can do this, if I can do that, if I feel happy. Okay. Did you want to add something, Justin?
Yeah, and kind of tacking on there, I think clearly not a metric, but if you have confidence in the system, in the setup, then I think DevOps is working. If you don't, then it's not.
I kind of disagree that that's not a metric. I think it is a metric. I'd call that a qualitative metric.
Yeah.
And I'm really pleased you mentioned confidence, because I think one thing that I think does get missed in DevOps is, in general, I think we didn't mention this earlier, that there needs to be a basic level of engineering maturity before you can start to think about any kind of transformation, right? Whether it be microservices, DevOps, whatever you want to call it. In fact, they go quite closely together, I think. But confidence that your system works, I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen lacking as a consultant when I go around. You know, people say stuff like, oh, well, it doesn't work. And I'd be like, well, how do you know it doesn't work? You haven't got any unit tests, so you can't tell me it doesn't work. So, you know, confidence in the system, I think, is a great metric. However you measure it is a different question, but no, I definitely have that up there. You know, the confidence, because if you've got confidence, you can do 200 releases a day, right? And you can start making the releases smaller. I mean, I think that's part of the DevOps mindset myself. Okay. I wanted to ask, where am I? Okay, down here. Yeah. So on that note, what does somebody want to pick up? I think what would be the sort of bare minimum level of sort of tooling that you'd need to be able to defensively claim, right, we're doing DevOps? What tools do you think you need out there? John?
For me, like I said earlier, have your system in containers, and then that's the bare minimum in my mind. And then, of course, there's a lot, you know, actually run your tests in the containers and have a pipeline. You know, of course, now it's starting to grow, but that in my mind is the bare minimum.
Do you think there's any difference between, say, so obviously you've got containerization, we need a pipeline. Is there any difference between, say, using GitHub or Circle CI or any of the common tools for that stuff, do you think?
Well, having recently set up our CI pipeline in GitHub Actions, it's painful. Some of the other systems are a lot less painful when it comes to doing Docker-based things in GitHub Actions specifically, mainly because for GitHub there's you have to wait until you get feedback. You can't run it on your machine. There's no way to, yeah. There's some tools that kind of help you a little bit, but anyway. So that's my main thing. Some of the other toolings, some of the other companies that just focus on this just do a better job. To be fair.
Right. What does better job mean in this circumstance, you think?
More documentation, have been setting up CI pipelines with Docker containers for a longer time, so they've bumped into a lot of different things. Maybe there's better tooling for you to run it on your own system and get the same results that they would get. Okay.
So containerization, I think you said it a couple of times. That's probably, for you, that's a massive enabler. Why, does somebody else want to pick up? I mean, Johnny, perhaps, why do you agree that containerization is a big enabler, and what is it about containerization?
I would say for me, it's really helpful. I wouldn't put it as my minimum. I have a different idea for what's minimum for a DevOps team or DevOps development process. I do agree that containerization is a very good thing, because for me, you can basically run everything in containers. You can run your pipelines in a container. You can run your applications in a container on different environments. And the plus that this provides is that you always start from scratch. You always start with an empty container, and you're not influenced by things that were happening beforehand. When you have a pipeline running on a specific built machine, then somebody can install crap on that machine, or you maybe have something that happened from a previous iteration of your pipeline. While if you're using a container, it basically always starts from scratch, and that gives you a clean environment that should always have the exact same outcome. So in that sense, I do agree.
Right, I see. Yeah, to me that's a really important thing, because I've seen a lot of people saying, well, we've got this continuous integration pipeline thing, but actually what they do is they build a thing, test it there, then they build it again and test it there, and I'm like, well, you're not going to get confidence over that. You've rebuilt it. How do you even know you've used the same build? You know, and for me, it's sort of answering my own question about the different things. I think Circle CI has improved considerably, but I remember I first came across it about 3 or 4 years ago when I think it was quite an immature product, and it actually gave no visibility then, or at least the version we had, of even the version of the build tools that were going to build your thing. You know, you could sort of choose it and say, well, I'm building a Java thing, but you had no idea what build tool it was going to use, right? And then you couldn't say, you didn't know what version of the Java runtime was executing on the virtual machine that was going to run your tests. So it had all sorts of shortcomings like that. I think they've been addressed now, so I don't want to go too much in that. But yeah, I think cycling back to your point about confidence as well, Justin, because you know, to get confidence that your thing is going to work in production, I think containerization, that would be one of the most important things to me, because otherwise, you know, how do you know it's worked? You just can't do it. Okay. I wanted to ask about just for a moment. I'm going to throw this question out to Michael, because you've worked on a few as a consultant. I'm sure you've worked in different stacks and so on. For me, part of DevOps that's really important is, and this definitely came up in the earlier discussion, is this sort of observability of our system. So, you know, understanding the state of the system, understanding whether it's working, having confidence, and so on. What sort of tooling have you used around that whole notion of observability and traceability and trackability, and how much importance do you place on that?
So it depends on your architecture. So the more complex, the more moving parts you have, observability come into place with more significance. For me, observability is composed of three main things. It's logs, metrics, and tracing. And I think each persona in the R&D organization is going to deep dive into one of those with more details. I think logs and traces are more appealing for developers, where metrics are more appealing for operations. And I think the first question you need to ask yourself is whether you're going to buy or you're going to build something. There is tons of open source. There is tons of offering that you can implement yourself, and you can also get it from your cloud provider or from a third-party vendor. So I think you have a lot of options to choose from, and it's how to know in early days what you will need. For me, it's keeping my options open as I go, the understanding that I need to have all the three traces, logs, and metrics, and to know that different persona in my organization are going to investigate different aspects of the overall observability.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. That you said all the people in the organization need to do something, right? And I sometimes wonder, again, this might be our communication problem in general in the world at the moment, but you have to get people to care about their metrics, right? I think it always comes back to that, like getting people to look. I mean, I've got this mantra, I've had it for a few years. When there's an incident, and this is another metric, like a qualitative metric, right? How did we find out about that incident, right? The best way we find out about it is before it ever got to live, right? Because we caught it, because our observation in our pre-production environment is so good that we caught this thing before it goes live. The next best way is we caught it and fixed it before it affected the customer. Then there's we caught it and fixed it, but a customer had some effect. And then the absolute worst is a customer told us about it. And you know, it's all your observability helps with that. And I think the whole attitude of getting people to care, but I'm stuck with getting people to care at the moment sometimes.
Yeah. I think sometimes people consider observability for production purposes. I have an incident, now I need to resolve it fast. And we do need to think about observability in pre-production.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have a test that failed in your CI, you want to use the same tools that you're using in production in your testing, because it gives you this muscle memory of how am I using those tools to understand my system in any environment.
Sure. And I think I remember doing that on a job I did for ThoughtWorks, cleaning the production logs so that anything that happened in production was a call to action. And somebody said to my team, so you've finished with cleaning now, right? And I was like, no, I'm going to do the pre-production environment now. And they're like, you're mad. Why do you want to do that? And I said, well, would you not rather find out about an error when somebody's QAing something, or whether it's going through integration testing, find out about something then? So if I make it a call to action in pre-prod, I'm fixing stuff before it's ever an issue. But I think and this segues into what I'm going to just mention next. That segues into me saying, I think that's quite mature as a team to be able to do that. I don't know, do any of you have a sort of idea about, is DevOps maturity something that we should consider and think about? And is there any sort of tools around that? Do you know? Is that something you come across? I can move straight on to something else if we, because I know that the State of DevOps report uses surveys really to understand DevOps maturity. But I mean, I guess for my own, from what I've seen, for me, the ultimate maturity is probably that. You know, we find stuff in pre-production before it goes live. Maybe there's there's probably another level on that, isn't there? There's probably the Spotify Chaos Monkey type model, like taking stuff out of, they call it the Simian Army now, I think, don't they? Or at least, I always wonder whether these things are real or they're rumors. You know, people talk about Chaos Monkey and Simian Army. Do they really have a Simian Army, or is that just a cool thing that someone wrote in a blog post one time? Okay.
think maybe it's important to know if your team right today does not do DevOps. Don't try to dive into what you're talking about. Don't try to dive into doing everything at once, but move step by step. And this is that maturity, but it also is tightly linked with that confidence. When you dive into like everything at the same time, people are probably going to lose their confidence because they don't know what to do first. So just do it step by step so that confidence can grow and that maturity can grow.
I think that's a great lesson of any kind of transformation and change, actually. I mean, if you read the goal tells you, you know, and this was written in the 80s, just change, look at your biggest problem, fix that, then something else will be your biggest problem. I totally agree with that. I think that's probably a degree of maturity, the discipline of doing, we haven't really touched on it, but the discipline of doing continual improvement, I think that's part of DevOps as well.
Yes.
And for me, you know, understanding how you measure success on every level, and then understanding, again, we talked about qualitative metrics. And I think for me, they can be really helpful, right? Because a lot of what we measure is post hoc, right? It's after the event. If we talk about using the DORA metrics, the 4 key metrics, we only really measure, well, you can only measure deployment frequency after the event, right? You can only measure change fail rate after the event. But if there are 24 capabilities that help with those, you can put qualitative metrics around those. Are we good, reasonable, or crap at doing X? And therefore, you know, choose the ones which we think we're rubbish at and just focus on one in this month and improve that. I think that's a great practice. I think that's often missed as well. So go on.
I was going to say, what about this for maturity? First off, having geo redundancy is very important, having a geo failover, and then just randomly triggering it, being like, okay, we're turning off a geo today. And then, you know, if you can do that, then I think you're pretty high up on the...
I think so. I think so. I mean, I honestly think that having so few of the companies I work for as a consultant, but let's face it, as a consultant, particularly with some of the work I used to do for ThoughtWorks, they're a self-selecting group of companies that are broken in ways, you know. So I'm not saying the whole world is like this, but the level of maturity I saw, you know, that would be, you know, rocket science if people could actually, you know, trigger some event to verify their disaster recovery. I've seen that in so few places. Okay, there's one final thing I just want to ask about, which is, so when I switched to work for Currency Cloud just a month ago, and I'm actually not an infrastructure engineer. I'm head of platform engineering, but you know, I could read Terraform and guess what it did, but I've never written a Terraform file. What we're sort of looking at is building an internal platform now, and platform as a service. And in my head, that sounds like quite a big enabler for DevOps. I wonder, has anybody come across that sort of concept and been involved in it? No.
You mean that the platform team is serving the capabilities that they're doing to other teams?
That's the concept, yeah. I mean, so again, team topologies talks about this, X as a service, right? So if you come to me, Michael, and say, well, my dev team needs to put this thing in a container and deploy it into a Kubernetes cloud. Well, firstly, I'd say to you, well, actually, tell me what your real need is. Tell me what your customer-facing need is. But then I'd say, you know what, I'm not going to do it for you, but I'll build a tool that means that the next person that comes along can do it easily. And I think that might come back to the point that Johnny made about 15 minutes ago about how much enablement you do and how much work you do for teams, because that team that you mentioned, that DevOps team, that's a single point of failure. Maybe they were always just feeding people rather than teaching them how to fish. I don't know.
Yeah,
exactly. And for me, maybe that's where we go with DevOps maturity. I don't know.
I think in some sense, as a DevOps team or platform team providing services to other teams, you need to ask yourself, do I need to teach other teams how to do it, or should I create a tool to simplify it for them?
Yeah.
So in some cases, you want them to understand. In some cases, they don't need to understand, but it needs to be simplified. And I think the metric or the question to decide where it goes is, once you have an incident, do they need to operate it or not? And so if they do need to operate it, they need to understand how it works. But if it's not, so that's fine, and we can just simplify the process for them.
Yeah. Okay. This is the first time I've hosted such a chat, and I realised that we've had some questions fired at us that I completely forgot to look in the Q&A. So I'm just going to whiz through them in the last. We haven't got long left. I don't think we'll get cut off, so we can stay on for a few minutes if people are willing. The first question is: any of you have experience with introducing DevOps mindset in legacy organisations where there is still handover to dedication operations department? I have. It was painful, and in general, I would say two things about that. One, there's a great quote from Peter Senge, which is people don't resent change, they resent being changed. And when you try to introduce change, I would recommend you are getting people to buy into that change. And as a consultant, what I always tried to do was to try and understand what it means for that person and also try and understand their fears. So typically in that handover to ops department type scenario, I think they fear being redundant. So the sort of general mantra that we would come up with at ThoughtWorks was, we are helping you we're giving you time to do your job more effectively so that you can innovate in your space. And when you put it like that, maybe most people get excited by that, and ops people might start thinking, well, actually, maybe it's fun to collaborate more closely. It is painful, though. I won't deny that.
Yeah, I experienced the same thing. So I also worked in a team in the past where they had a very split up operations department, and they were really on themselves. And we basically decided to do it in little steps. We told them about our pipelining tools. They started working with those tools themselves to provision their servers, just to learn what it looks like. And we did our development thing. And then just small steps. The first part of our release pipeline was not using all of the integrated tools to release to different servers. No, it was just one big PowerShell script that the operations department had written. We introduced it in our pipelines and so by step, we were working closer and closer together. Also, give them a step-by-step confidence in the system and work towards each other.
Yeah. Okay. The next question says, how do you get developers to start caring about ops concerns in an organization that doesn't yet do DevOps? I kind of think it's the same answer. It's about understanding what their motivations are, but does anybody want to, and explaining to them how it makes their life better?
Yeah,
I think it's in some sense it's making operation problems their problem.
Yeah,
and with that making them care about the operation. Then they will put it in their considerations.
Okay. And the final question is, how do you get operations teams to start sharing their knowledge and privileges with developers in an organization that doesn't do DevOps? Again, that feels like a mashup of the first two answers, but does anybody want to? Yeah, I think it's about, letting them know that they're innovating. Okay, I'm conscious we've run over time. So just to wrap up, it would be good if we could just go around the table. I'll start with Johnny. The question's going to be, what's the single most important idea and the single most important tool to enable DevOps?
For me, it's source control. Source control, and not only your source, but for me, when doing DevOps, everything should be source controlled. Your code, of course, your documentation, and that's also an answer to the final question. When the operations team also documents and uses source control for their documentation, everyone can access it and everyone can see the history. Your infrastructure should also be, or your infrastructure code or scripts or whatever should also be source controlled. For me, that's the biggest part. That's the most important.
Thank you. And Justin, I think I probably know your answer on tooling, but I'll throw the question to you.
Well, let's go into that a little bit. I think one of the things that I saw, which really intrigued me, and I think is kind of cool, is not being scared of legacy code. And specifically, I was talking to a bank, and they had all of their COBOL software. They put it in containers, and then they just ran it serverless, and then that was that. They didn't have to manage it anymore.
That's advanced.
And it could just die a slow death, the way that legacy software should, instead of making the person that manages it die a slow death.
Well, yeah,
that would be my 2 cents.
Brilliant. Okay, and Michael.
Well, I got stolen the good stuff, but I'll say that the third next thing would be probably observability, and giving everybody access to what they need to operate the system.
No, brilliant. Okay, well, I mean, I'll just answer my own question. My single biggest concept, I'd say, is ownership for everybody. And I think tooling-wise, yeah, I'm going to go right back to the days before we had pipelines, because I thought it was absolutely magic when one of my colleagues used Octopus Deploy to deploy stuff and do it consistently. So for me, whatever your pipeline tooling is the most important thing. Great. Sorry we ran over time. I hope we managed to keep some or all of our audience. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to the three of you. It's a shame we're not actually in the same building in where because I'm sure we would probably go to the pub if we were. So thanks very much for your time, everybody. And it'd be nice if we can meet up in person at some point in the next few months or years.
I hope so.
Good. Okay.
Cool.
So I'm going to end the session now. Thanks very much for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Done. Thanks.